Page 157. 5. The man spoke to her. His voice was serious and was almost a whisper. "My child, that is very heavy for you, which you are carrying there." Cosette raised her head and answered, "Yes, monsieur." "Give it to me," the man continued. "I will carry it for you." Cosette let go of the bucket. The man walked along with her. "It is very heavy indeed," said he to himself. Then he added, "Little girl, how old are you?" 8 years, monsieur." "And have you come far in this way?" "From the spring in the woods." "And are you going far?" "A good quarter of an hour from here." The man remained a moment without speaking. Then he said abruptly, "You have no mother, then?" "I don't know," answered the child. Before the man had time to say a word, she added, "I don't believe I have. All the rest have one. For my part, I have none." And after a silence, she added, "I believe I never had any." The man stopped, put the bucket on the ground, stooped down, and placed his hands upon the child's shoulders, making an effort to look at her and to see her face in the darkness. The thin and puny face of Cosette was vaguely outlined in the livid sky of the night. "What is your name?" said the man. "Cosette." It seemed as if the man had an electric shock. He looked at her again, and letting go of her shoulders, took up the bucket and walked on. A moment after he asked, "Little girl, where do you live?" "At Montfermeil, if you know it." "It is there that we are going." "Yes, monsieur." He made another pause. Then he began, "Who is it that has sent you out into the woods after the water at this time of night?" "Madame Thénardier." The man resumed with a tone of voice which he tried to render indifferent, but in which there was nevertheless singular tremor. "What does she do, your Madame Thénardier?" "She is my mistress," said the child. "She keeps the tavern." "The tavern," said the man. "Well, I am going there to lodge tonight. Show me the way." "We are going there," said the child. The man walked very fast. Cosette followed him without difficulty. She felt fatigue no more. From time to time she raised her eyes toward this man, a sort of tranquillity and inexpressible confidence. She had never been taught to turn toward Providence and to pray. However, she felt in her bosom something that resembled joy and hope, and which rose toward heaven. A few minutes passed. The man spoke. "Is there no servant at Madame Thénardier's?" "No, monsieur." "Are you alone?" "Yes, monsieur." There was another interval of silence. Cosette raised her voice. "That is, there are 2 little girls." What little girls?" "Ponine and Zelma." The child simplified in this way the romantic names dear to the mother. "What are Ponine and Zelma?" "They are Madame Thénardier's young ladies, you might say her daughters." "And what do they do?" "Oh," said the child, "they have beautiful dolls, things which there's gold in, and they are very full of business. They play, they amuse themselves." "All day long?" "Yes, monsieur." "And you?" "Me? I work." "All day long?" The child raised her large eyes, in which there was a tear which could not be seen in the darkness, and answered softly, "Yes, monsieur." She continued after an interval of silence. "Sometimes when I have finished my work, and they are willing, I amuse myself also." "How do you amuse yourself?" "The best I can. They let me alone. But I have not many playthings. Ponine and Zelma are not willing for me to play with their little dolls, but I have one little lead sword, not longer than that." The child showed her little finger. "And which does not cut." "Yes, monsieur," said the child. "It cuts lettuce and flies' heads." They reached the village. Cosette guided the stranger through the streets. The man questioned her no more, and now maintained a mournful silence. When they had passed the church, the man, seeing all of these booths in the street, asked Cosette, "Is it fair time here?" "No, monsieur, it is Christmas." As they drew near the tavern, Cosette timidly touched his arm. "Monsieur?" "What, my child?" "Here we are close by the house." "Well?" "Will you let me take the bucket now?" "What for?" "Because if madame sees that anybody brought it for me, she will beat me." The man gave her the bucket. A moment after, they were at the big door of the chop house. Page 166. Cosette could not help casting one look toward the grand doll still displayed in the toy shop. Then she rapped. The door opened. The Thénardier appeared with a candle in her hand. "Oh, it is you, you little beggar, Ladamasie. You have taken your time. She has been playing the wench." "Madam," said Cosette, trembling, "there is a gentleman who is coming to lodge." The Thénardier very quickly replaced her fierce air by her amiable grimace, a change at sight peculiar to innkeepers, and looked for the newcomer with eager eyes. "Is it monsieur?" said she. "Yes, madam," answered the man, touching his hat. Rich travelers are not so polite. This gesture on the side of the stranger's costume and baggage, which the Thénardier passed in review at a glance, made the amiable grimace disappear and the fierce air reappear. She added dryly, "Enter, good man." The good man entered. Then the Thénardier cast a second glance at him, examined particularly his long coat, which was absolutely threadbare, and his hat, which was somewhat broken, and with a nod, a wink, and a turn of her nose consulted her husband, who was still drinking with the wagoners. The husband answered by the imperceptible shake of the forefinger, which, supported by a protrusion of the lips, signifies in such a case complete destitution. Upon this the Thénardier exclaimed, "Ah, my brave man, I am very sorry, but I have no room." "Put me where you will," said the man. "In the garret, in the stable, I will pay as if I had a room. 40 sous. 40 sous, well. In advance. 40 sous, whispered a wagoner to the Thénardier. But it is only 20 sous. It is 40 sous for him, replied the Thénardier in the same tone. I don't lodge poor people for less. That is true, added her husband softly. It ruins a house to have this sort of people. Meanwhile, the man, after leaving his stick and bundle on a bench, and seated himself at a table on which Cosette had been quick to place a bottle of wine and a glass, the peddler who had asked for a bucket of water had gone himself to carry it to his horse. Cosette had resumed her place under the kitchen table, and her knitting. The man, who hardly touched his lips to the wine he had turned out, was contemplating the child with a strange attention. Cosette was ugly. Happy she might, perhaps, have been pretty. Cosette was thin and pale. She was nearly 8 years old, but one could hardly have thought her 6. Her large eyes, sunk in a sort of shadow, were almost out by continual weeping. The corners of her mouth had that curve of habitual anguish which is seen in the condemned and the hopelessly sick. Her hands were covered with chilblains. The light of the fire which was shining upon her made her bones stand out and rendered her thinness fearfully visible. As she was always shivering, she had acquired the habit of drawing her knees together. Her whole dress was nothing but a rag, which would have excited pity in the summer, and which excited horror in the winter. She had on nothing but cotton, and that full of holes, not a rag of woolen. Her skin showed here and there, and black and blue spots could be distinguished which indicated the places where the Thénardier had touched her. Her naked legs were red and rough. The hollows under her collar-bones would make one weep. The whole person of this child, her gait, her attitude, the sound of her voice, the intervals between one word and another, her looks, her silence, her least motion expressed and uttered a single idea: fear. Fear was spread all over her. She was, so to say, covered with it. Fear drew back her elbows against her sides, drew her heels under her skirt, made her take the least possible room, prevented her from breathing more than was absolutely necessary, and had become what might be called her bodily habit. Without possible variation except of increase, there was in the depth of her eye an expression of astonishment mingled with terror. This fear was that, on coming in, all wet as she was, Cosette had not dared to go and dry herself by the fire, but had gone silently to her work. The expression of the countenance of this child of 8 years was habitually so sad, and sometimes so tragical, that it seemed at certain moments as if she were in the way of becoming an idiot, or a demon. Never, as we have said, had she known what it is to pray. Never had she set foot within a church. "How can I spare the time?" said the Thénardier. The man in the yellow coat did not take his eyes from Cosette. "Oh, you want supper?" asked the Thénardier of the traveller. He did not answer. He seemed to be thinking deeply. "What is that man?" she said between her teeth. "It is some frightful pauper. He hasn't a penny for his supper. Is he going to pay me for his lodging only? It is very lucky, anyway, that he didn't think to steal that money that was on the floor." A door now opened, and Éponine and Azelma came in. They were really 2 pretty little girls, rather city girls than peasants, very charming, one with her well-polished auburn tresses and the other with long black braids falling down her back, and both so lively, neat, plump, fresh, and healthy that it was a pleasure to see them. They were warmly clad, but only with such maternal art, and that the thickness of the stuff detracted nothing from the coquetry of the fit. Winter was provided against without effacing spring. These 2 little girls shed light around them. Moreover, they were regent in their toilet and in their gaiety. In the noise they made there was sovereignty. When they entered, the Thénardier said to them in a scolding tone which was full of adoration, "Ah, you are here then, you children." They went and sat down by the fire. They had a doll which they turned backward and forward upon their knees, with many pretty prattlings. From time to time, Cosette raised her knees from her knitting and looked sadly at them as they were playing. Eponine and Azelma did not notice Cosette. To them she was like the dog. These little girls could not count 24 years among them all, and they were already represented all human society. On one side envy, on the other disdain. The doll of the Thénardier sisters was very much faded and very old and broken. It appeared none the less wonderful to Cosette, who had never in her life had a doll, a real doll, to use an expression that all children will understand. All at once the Thénardier, who was continually going and coming about the room, noticed that Cosette's attention was distracted, and that instead of working she was busied with the little girls who were playing. "Ah, I've caught you," cried she. "That is the way you will work. I'll make you work with a cowhide, I will." The stranger, without leaving his chair, turned toward the Thénardier. "Madam," said he, smiling diffidently, "pshaw, let her play." On the part of any traveller who had eaten a slice of mutton and drunk 2 bottles of wine at his supper, and who had not the appearance of a horrid pauper, such a wish would have been a command. But that a man who wore that hat should allow himself to have a desire, and that a man who wore that coat should permit himself to have a wish, was what the Thénardier thought ought not to be tolerated. She replied sharply, "She must work, for she eats. I don't support her to do nothing." "And what is it she is making?" said the stranger, in that gentle voice which contrasted so strangely with his beggar's clothes and his porter's shoulders. The Thénardier deigned to answer. "Stockings, if you please. Stockings for my little girls who have none. We're speaking of, and will soon be going barefooted." The man looked at Cosette's poor red feet and continued, "When will she finish that pair of stockings?" "It will take her at least 3 or 4 good days, the lazy thing." "And how much might this pair of stockings be worth when she is finished?" The Thénardier cast a disdained glance at him. "At least 30 sous." "Would you take 5 francs for them?" said the man. "Goodness!" exclaimed the wagoner, who was listening with a hoarse laugh. 5 francs! It's a humbug! 5 bullets!" Thénardier now thought it was time to speak. "Yes, monsieur, if that is your fancy, if you can have that pair of stockings for 5 francs. We can't refuse anything to travellers." "You must pay for them now," said the Thénardier, in her short and peremptory way. "I will buy that pair of stockings," answered the man, "and," added he, drawing a 5-franc piece from his pocket and laying it on the table, "I will pay for them." Then he turned toward Cosette. "Now your work belongs to me. Play, my child." The wagoner was so affected by the 5-franc piece that he left his glass and went to look at it. "It's so. That's a fact," cried he as he looked at it. "A regular hind wheel, and no counterfeit." Thénardier approached, and silently put the piece in his pocket. The Thénardier said nothing to reply. She bit her lips, and her face assumed an expression of hatred. Meanwhile, Cosette trembled. She ventured to ask, "Madam, is it true? Can I play?" "Play," said the Thénardier in a terrible voice. "Thank you, madam," said Cosette. And while her mouth thanked the Thénardier, all her little soul was thankful for the traveller. Thénardier turned to his drink. His wife whispered in his ear, "What can that yellow man be?" "I have seen," answered Thénardier in a commanding tone, "millionaires with coats like that." Cosette had left her knitting, but she had not moved from her place. Cosette always stirred as little as was possible. She had taken from a little box behind her a few old rags and her little lead sword. Eponine and Azelma paid no attention to what was going on. They had just performed a very important operation. They had caught the kitten, they had thrown the doll on the floor, and Eponine and the elder were dressing the kitten, in spite of her meowings and contortions, with a lot of clothes and red and blue rags. Meanwhile, the drinkers were singing an obscene song, at which they laughed enough to shake the room. Thénardier encouraged them, and accompanied them. As birds make a nest of anything, children make a doll of no matter what. While Eponine and Azelma were dressing up the cat, Cosette, for her part, had dressed up the sword. That done, she laid it upon her arm and was singing it softly to sleep. The Thénardier, on her part, approached the yellow man. "My husband is right," thought she. "It may be Monsieur Lafayette. Some rich men are so odd." She came and rested her elbow on the table at which he was sitting. "Monsieur," said she. At the word "monsieur," the man turned. The Thénardier had called him before only brave man or good man. "You see, monsieur," she pursued, putting on her sweetest look, which was still more unendurable than her ferocious manner, "I am very willing the child should play. I am not opposed to it. It is well for once, because you are generous. But you see, she is poor. She must work." "The child is not yours, then?" asked the man. "Oh dear, no, monsieur. It is a little pauper that we have taken in through charity, a sort of imbecile child. She must have water on her brain. Her head is big, as you see. We do all we can for her, but we are not rich. We write in vain to her country. For 6 months we have had no answer. We think that her mother must be dead." "Ah," said the man, as he fell back into his reverie. "This mother was no great thing," cried the Thénardiers. "She abandoned her child." During all this conversation, Cosette, as if an instinct had warned her that they were talking about her, had not taken her eyes from the Thénardiers. She listened. She heard a few words here and there. Meanwhile, the drinkers, all 3/4 drunk, were repeating their foul chorus with redoubled gaiety. It was highly spiced with jests, in which the names of the Virgin and of the child Jesus were often heard. The Thénardiers had gone to take her part in the hilarity. Cosette, under the table, was looking into the fire, which was reflected from her fixed eye. She was again rocking the sort of rag baby that she had made, and as she rocked it, she sang in a low voice, "My mother is dead. My mother is dead. My mother is dead." At the repeated entreaties of the hostess, the yellow man, the millionaire, had finally consented to sup. "And what will monsieur have? Some bread and cheese," said the man. "Decidedly it is a beggar," thought the Thénardiers. The revellers continued to sing their song, and the child under the table also sang hers. All at once Cosette stopped. She had just turned and seen the little Thénardier's doll, which they had forsaken for the cat, and left on the floor, a few steps from the kitchen table. Then she let the bundled up sword that only half satisfied her fall, and ran her eyes slowly around the room. The Thénardier was whispering to her husband, and counting some money. Éponine and Azelma were playing with the cat. The travelers were eating or drinking or singing. Nobody was looking at her. She had not a moment to lose. She crept out from under the table on her hands and knees, made sure once more that nobody was watching her, then darted quickly to the doll and seized it. An instant afterwards she was at her place, seated, motionless, only turned in such a way as to keep the doll that she held in her arms in the shadow. The happiness of playing with the doll was so rare to her that it had all the violence of rapture. Nobody had seen her except the traveler who was slowly eating his meager supper. This joy lasted for nearly a quarter of an hour, but in spite of Cosette's precautions, she did not perceive that one of the doll's feet stuck out, and that the fire of the fireplace lighted up very vividly. This rosy and luminous foot which protruded from the shadows suddenly caught Azelma's eye, and she said to Éponine, "Oh, sister!" The 2 little daughters stopped, stupefied. Cosette had dared to take the doll. Éponine got up, and without letting go of the cat, went to her mother and began to pull at her skirt. "Let me alone," said the mother. "What do you want?" "Mother," said the child, "look there," and she pointed at Cosette. Cosette, wholly absorbed in the ecstasy of her possession, saw and heard nothing else. The face of the Thénardier assumed the peculiar expression which is composed of the terrible mingled with the commonplace, and which has given this class of women the name of furies. This time, wounded pride exasperated her anger still more. Cosette had leapt over all barriers. Cosette had laid her hands upon the doll of those young ladies. A Czarina, who had seen a Bolshevik trying on the grand cordon of her imperial son, would have had the same expression. She cried with a voice harsh with indignation, "Cosette!" Cosette shuddered, as if the earth had quaked beneath her. She turned around. "Cosette!" repeated the Thénardiers. Cosette took the child and placed it gently on the floor, with a kind of veneration mingled with despair. Then, without taking away her eyes, she joined her hands with what is fright to tell a child of that age. She wrung them. Then what none of the emotions of that day had drawn from her, neither the run in the wood, nor the weight of the bucket of the water, nor even the stern words she had heard from the Thénardiers, she burst into tears. She sobbed. Meanwhile the traveller arose. "What is the matter?" said he to the Thénardiers. "Don't you see?" said the Thénardier, pointing with her finger toward the corpus delicti lying at Cosette's feet. "Well, what is that?" said the man. "That beggar," answered the Thénardier, "has dared to touch the children's doll." "All this noise about that?" said the man. "Well, what if she did play with that doll?" "She has touched it with her dirty hands," continued the Thénardier, "with her horrid hands." Here Cosette redoubled her sobs. "Be still," cried the Thénardier. The man walked straight to the street door, opened it, and went out. As soon as he was gone, The Thénardiers profited by his absence to give Cosette under the table a severe kick, which made the child shriek. The door opened again, and the man reappeared holding in his hands the fabulous doll of which we have spoken, and which had been the admiration of all the youngsters of the village since the morning he stood it up before Cosette, saying, "Here, this is for you." It is probable that during the time which he had been there, more than an hour, in the midst of his reverie, he had caught confused glimpses of this toy shop, lighted up with lamps and candles so splendidly that it shone through the bar-room window like an illumination. Cosette raised her eyes, and she saw the man approach her with that doll, as she would have seen the sun approach. She heard those astounding words, "This is for you." She looked at him, and she looked at the doll. Then she drew back slowly, and went and hid as far as she could under the table in the corner of the room. She wept no more. She cried no more. She had the appearance of no longer daring to breathe. The Thénardiers, Éponine, and Azelma were so many statues. Even the drinkers stopped. There was a solemn silence in the whole bar-room. The Thénardiers, petrified and mute, recommenced her conjectures anew. What is this old fellow? Is he a pauper? Is he a millionaire? Perhaps he's both. That is a robber. The face of the husband, the Thénardier, presented that expressive wrinkle in which marks the human countenance whenever the dominant instinct appears in it, with all its brutal power. The innkeeper contemplated by turns the doll, the traveller. He seemed to be scenting this man as he would have scented a bag of money. This only lasted for a moment. He approached his wife and whispered to her, "That machine cost at least 30 francs. No nonsense. Down on your knees before this man." Coarse natures have this in common with artless natures, that they have no transitions. "Well, Cosette," said the Thénardiers, with a voice which was meant to be sweet, and which was entirely composed of the sour honey of vicious women, "ain't you going to take your doll?" Cosette ventured to come out of her hole. "My little Cosette," said the Thénardier with a caressing air, "Monsieur gives you a doll. Take it. It is yours." Cosette looked upon the wonderful doll with a sort of terror. Her face still flooded with tears, but her eyes began to fill, like the sky in the breaking of dawn, with the strange radiations of joy. What she experienced at that moment was almost like what she would have felt if someone had said to her suddenly, "Little girl, you are Queen of France." It seemed to her that if she touched that doll, thunder would spring forth from it, which was true to some extent, for she thought that the Thénardiers would scold and beat her. However, the attraction overcame her. She finally approached and timidly murmured, turning toward the Thénardiers, "Can I, madam?" No expression can describe her look, at once full of despair, dismay, and transport. "Good Lord," said the Thénardiers, "it is yours, since monsieur gives it to you." "Is it true? Is it true, monsieur?" said Cosette. "Is the lady for me?" The stranger appeared to have his eyes full of tears. He seemed to be at that stage of emotion which one does not speak for fear of weeping. He nodded assent to Cosette, and put the hand of the lady in her little hand. Cosette withdrew her hand hastily, as if that of the lady burned her, and she looked down at the floor. We are compelled to add that at that instant she thrust out her tongue enormously. All at once she turned and seized the doll eagerly. "I will call her Catherine," said she. It was a strange moment when Cosette's rags met and pressed against the ribbons and the fresh pink muslins of the doll. "Madam," said she, "may I put her in a chair?" "Yes, my child," answered the Thénardiers. It was Éponine and Azelma now who looked upon Cosette with envy. Cosette placed Catherine in a chair, then sat down on the floor before her, and remained motionless, without saying a word, in the attitude of contemplation. "Why don't you play, Cosette?" said the stranger. "Oh, I am playing," answered the child. This stranger, this unknown man, who seemed like a visit from Providence to Cosette, was at that moment the being which the Thénardiers hated more than any else in the world. However, she was compelled to restrain herself. Her emotions were more than she could endure. Accustomed as she was to dissimulation, by endeavoring to copy her husband in all her actions, she sent her daughters to bed immediately, then asked the yellow man's permission to send Cosette to bed, who was very tired today. Added she with a motherly air. Cosette went to bed, holding Catherine in her arms. Several hours passed away. The midnight mass was said. The revel was finished. The drinkers had gone. The house was closed. The room was deserted. The fire had gone out. The stranger still remained in the same place and in the same posture. From time to time he changed the elbow on which he rested. That was all. but he had not spoken a word since Cosette was gone. Thénardier moved, coughed, spit, blew his nose, and creaked his chair. The man did not stir. "Is he asleep?" thought Thénardier. The man was not asleep, but nothing could arouse him. Finally, Thénardier took off his cap, approached softly, and ventured to say, "Is monsieur not going to repose?" "Yes," said the stranger, "you are right. Where is your stable?" "Monsieur," said the Thénardier with a smile, "I will conduct monsieur." He took the candle, the man took his bundle and his staff, and Thénardier led him to a room on the first floor, which was very showy, furnished all in mahogany, with a high post bedstead and red calico curtains. "What is this?" said the traveller. "It is properly our bridal chamber," said the innkeeper. "We occupy another like this, my spouse and I. This is not open more than 3 or 4 times in a year." "I should have liked the stable as well," said the man, bluntly. Thénardier did not appear to hear this, and was not very civil answer. He lighted 2 entirely new wax candles, which displayed upon the mantel. A good fire was blazing in the fireplace. When the traveller turned again, the host had disappeared. Thénardier had discreetly taken himself out of the way, without daring to say good night, not desiring to treat with a disrespectful cordiality a man whom he proposed to skin royally in the morning. Page 173, 7. On the following morning, at least 2 hours before day, Thénardier, seated at a table in the bar-room, a candle by his side, with pen in hand, was making out the bill of the traveller in the yellow coat. His wife was standing half bent over him, following him with her eyes. Not a word passed between them. It was on one side a profound meditation, on the other that religious admiration with which we observe a marvel of the human mind spring up and expand. A noise was heard in the house. It was the lark, sweeping the stairs. After a good quarter of an hour and some erasers, the Thénardier produced his masterpiece. Then he went out. He was scarcely out of the room when the traveller came in. Thénardier reappeared immediately behind him, and remained motionless in the half-open door, visible only to his wife. The yellow man carried his staff and bundle in his hand. "Up so soon?" said the Thénardiers. "Is monsieur going to up and leave us already?" The traveller appeared preoccupied and absent-minded. He answered, "Yes, madam, I am going away." "Monsieur, then, had no business at Montfermeil?" replied she. "No, I am passing through. That is all, madam," added he. "What do I owe?" The Thénardier, without answering, handed him the folded bill. The man unfolded the paper and looked at it, but his thoughts were evidently elsewhere. "Madam," replied he, "do you do a good business in Montfermeil?" So, monsieur," answered the Thénardier, stupefied at seeing no other explosion. She continued in a mournful and lamenting strain. "Oh, monsieur, the times are hard, and then we have so few rich people around here. It is a very little place, you see. If we only had rich travelers now and then, like monsieur, we have so many expenses. Why, that little girl eats us out of house and home." The man replied in a voice which he endeavored to render indifferent, and in which there was a slight tremulousness. "Suppose you were relieved of her." "Who? Cosette?" "Yes." The red and violent face of the woman became illumined with a hideous expression. "Ah, monsieur, my good monsieur, take her, keep her, take her away, carry her off, sugar her, stuff her, drink her, eat her, and be blessed by the Holy Virgin and all the saints in paradise." "Agreed." "Really? You will take her away?" "I will." "Immediately?" "Immediately. Call the child." "Cosette," cried the Thénardier. "In the meantime," continued the man, "I will pay my bill." "How much is it?" She cast a glance at the bill, and could not repress a moment of surprise. 23 francs. At this moment Thénardier advanced into the middle of the room, and said, "Monsieur owes 26 sous." 26 sous!" exclaimed the woman. 26 sous for the room," continued Thénardier coldly, "and 6 for supper. As to the little girl, I must have some talk with the monsieur about that." "Leave us, wife." The Thénardier was dazzled by one of those unexpected flashes which emanate from talent. She felt that the great actor had entered upon the scene, answered not a word, and went out. As soon as they were alone, Thénardier offered the traveller a chair. The traveller sat down, but Thénardier remained standing, and his face assumed a singular expression of good nature and simplicity. "Monsieur," said he, "listen. I must say that I adore this child." The stranger looked at him steadily. "What child?" Thénardier continued. "How strangely we became attached. This child I adore." "Who is that?" asked the stranger. "Oh, our little Cosette." And you wish to take her away from us. Indeed, I must frankly, as true as you are, an honorable man. I cannot consent to it. I should miss her. I have had her since she was very small, it is true. She costs us money. It is true that she has her faults. It is true that we are not rich. It is true I paid 400 francs for medicines at one time when she was sick. But we must do something for God. She has neither father nor mother. I have brought her up. I have bread enough for her and for myself. In fact, I must keep this child, you understand. We have affections. I am a good beast myself. I do not reason. I love this little girl. My wife is hasty, but she loves her also. You see, she is like our own child. I feel the need of her prattle in the house. The stranger was looking steadily at him all the while. He continued, Pardon me, excuse me, monsieur, but one does not give his child like that to a traveler. Isn't it true that I am right? After that, I don't say you are rich and have the appearance of a very fine man. It is for her advantage, but I must know about it, you understand. On the supposition that I should let her go and sacrifice my own feelings, I should want to know where she is going. I would not want to lose sight of her. I should want to know who she was with, that I might come and see her now and then, and that she might know that her good foster father was still watching over her. Finally, there are things which are not possible. I do not know even your name. If you should take her away, I should say, Alas, for the little lark, where has she gone? I must at least see some poor rag of paper, a bit of a passport or something. The stranger, without removing from him this gaze which went, so to speak, to the bottom of his conscience, answered, in a severe and firm tone, Monsieur Thénardier, people do not take a passport to come 5 leagues from Paris. If I take Cosette, I take her. That is all. You will not know my name. You will not know my abode. You will not know where she goes, and my intention is that she shall never see you again in her life. Do you agree with that? Yes or no? As demons and genii recognize by certain signs the presence of a superior god, Thénardier comprehended that he was to deal with one who was very powerful. It came like an intuition. He understood it with his clear and quick sagacity. Although during this evening he had been drinking with the wagoners, smoking and singing bawdy songs, still he was observing the stranger all the while. He had surprised the searching glance of the old man, constantly returning to the child. Why this interest? What was this man? Why was so much money in his purse, this miserable dress? These were questions which he put to himself without being able to answer them. They irritated him. He had been thinking it over all night. This could not be Cosette's father. Was it a grandfather? Then why did he not make himself known at once? When a man has a right, he shows it. This man evidently had no right to Cosette. Then who was he? Thénardier was lost in conjectures. He caught glimpses of everything but saw nothing. However it might be when he commenced the conversation with this man, that there was a secret in all of this. Sure, that man had an interest in remaining unknown. He felt himself strong at the stranger's clear and firm answer. When he saw that this mysterious personage was mysterious and nothing more, he felt weak. He was expecting nothing of the kind. His conjectures were put to flight. He rallied his ideas. He weighed all in a second. Thénardier was one of those men who comprehended a situation at a glance. He decided that this, the moment to advance straight forward and swiftly. He did what great captains do at decisive instant, when they alone can recognize. He unmasked his battery at once. Monsieur, said he, I must have 1,500 francs. The stranger took from his side pocket, an old black leather notebook, opened it, and drew forth 3 banknotes, which he placed upon the table, then rested his large thumb on these bills, and said to the tavern keeper, Bring Cosette. An instant after, Cosette entered the bar-room. The stranger took the bundle and brought and untied it. This bundle contained a little wooden frock, an apron, a coarse cotton undergarment, a petticoat, a scarf, woolen stockings, and shoes, a complete dress for a girl of 7 years. It was all in black. My child, said the man, take this and go and dress yourself quick. The day was breaking when those of the inhabitants of the Montfermeil were beginning to open their doors, saw pass on the road to Paris a poorly clad goodman leading a little girl dressed in mourning, who had a pink doll in her arms. They were going toward Livery. It was a stranger and Cosette. No one recognized the man, as Cosette was not now in tatters. Few recognized her. Cosette was going away. With whom? She was ignorant. Where? She knew not. All she understood was that she was leaving behind the Thénardier chop-house. Nobody had thought of bidding her good-bye, nor had she nor had she of bidding good-bye to anybody. She went out from the house, hated and hating, poor gentle being whose heart had only been crushed hitherto. Cosette walked seriously along, opening her large eyes and looking at the sky. From time to time she looked at the good man. She felt something as if she were near God. On the evening of the same day, Jean Valjean entered Paris again at nightfall with the child, by the Barrière des Monceaux. There he took a cabarole, which carried him as far as the esplanade of the observatory. There he got out, paid the driver, took Cosette by the hand, and both in the darkness of the night, through the deserted streets in the vicinity of Le Rocher and La Galerie, walked toward the Boulevard des Hôpitaux. The day had been strange and full of emotions for Cosette. They had eaten behind hedges, bread and cheese, bought at isolated chop-houses. They had often changed carriages, and had travelled short distances on foot. She did not complain, but she was tired, and Jean Valjean perceived it, by pulling her more heavily at his hand while walking. He took her in his arms. Cosette, without letting go of Catherine, laid her head on Jean Valjean's shoulder, and went to sleep.